Wait. Before we start, just want to make sure we're clear here. While this podcast talks about sobriety, mental health, and addiction, it is not meant to replace professional medical advice. Welcome to Sisters in Sobriety.
I'm Kathleen.
And I'm Sonia.
And we're ex-sisters-in-law, brought together in marriage and bonded through our sobriety journey.
Join us as we talk sobriety, addiction, and everything in between. You're in for quite a ride. And our Substack is buzzing with amazing content, from creative mocktail recipes to insightful courses and reflective exercises. There is something for everyone. Don't miss out. It's a great way to add some extra joy and depth to your journey. Check it out. Welcome to Sisters in Sobriety. Today we're joined by Shannon Watts, activist, author, mom of 5, and someone who knows what it feels like to hit midlife and wonder, is this it? Shannon is the founder of Moms Demand Action, one of the largest organizations fighting for common sense gun safety. Her book, Fired Up: How to Turn Your Spark into a Flame and Come Alive at Any Age, is all about helping women rediscover their passion, especially in midlife. Hi, Shannon. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I loved this, not just because I am hitting midlife, but I have gone through this experience of trying to figure out what my passion is after, like a first career that was fairly successful. So, okay, in Fired Up, you talk a little bit about your earlier life and your upbringing and values and, what you were taught about being good and polite and staying small. So can you tell us like an early memory of feeling like your spark was being dimmed, even if you didn't realize it then?
I had to make a lot of compromises. I mean, I made a lot of choices that maybe in retrospect weren't great, right out of college. I talk about in the book the fact that my parents were going through a really brutal divorce. I was an only child and was just graduating and kind of saw my nuclear family implode. And I didn't do this consciously, but I married very quickly. I think, again, in retrospect, in hindsight, I was trying to reestablish some kind of family support. And that decision to get married at 23 set off a whole series of events that that really were not what I wanted, but what I needed in the moment. So, by the time I was 30, I had 3 kids. Because of that, I picked a career. Instead of becoming an investigative journalist, I ended up going to public relations. And it was just sort of like one choice after the other. And I found myself like in a car going 100 miles an hour down a highway that I really wasn't sure I wanted to be on. And I talk about how that culminated in a trip to the emergency room in my mid-30s because I had eczema basically on every inch of my body. And I know eczema is not a deadly disease, but it makes it very difficult to focus and to work and to sleep and to parent and to do all these things you need to do because you're so uncomfortable. And I tried everything, all these different remedies. And so finally I found myself in the emergency room and this doctor said to me, "How much stress are you under?" And I sort of flippantly answered, "How much time do you have?" And he didn't laugh. He just kind of kept this mind meld with me, right? Looking into my eyes. And I talk about how I had this mini nervous breakdown in his office where I realized a lot of the decisions I had made along the way had put me at a crossroads. I really had to decide, is this the way I wanted to spend the rest of my life, having made these choices that weren't really right for me? Or was I going to chart a completely new path? And there were consequences to both. I went home that night and I couldn't afford a therapist. I couldn't obviously confide in my husband because our marriage was part of the issue. And I just began to write this path forward in my journal, a roadmap to what I wanted to be and where I wanted to go. And that resulted in me making a lot of different life choices that ultimately helped me figure out the formula for coming alive, which is what I write about in the book, right? I figured out what my values, abilities, and desires were. And by bringing those together, that's ultimately in 2012 what led to the creation of Moms Demand Action.
So would you say this started with journaling or manifesting, or what would you call it?
I would call it a practice. that's how I look at things in my life as a practice or a discipline. I'm a secular Buddhist, and it's this idea of something you're going to do your entire life. And when I figured out my values, abilities, and desires, that was in 2012, I had taken about a 5-year break from my career to, at that point, blend my new family. I had divorced, I had remarried, we had 5 kids altogether. And I really spent that 5 years trying all kinds of different things. I started a small business. I became a yoga teacher. I just traveled and as I said, stepped aside from my career and decided to stay home. I did all these different things to figure out who I was and what I wanted. And when you figure out your values, and in 2012, I had little kids, so it was really protecting my family, my community, my abilities. I'd spent over a decade in a career in public relations, so I knew how to build a brand and craft a message. And then my desire, the morning of that horrific tragedy, it was really to stand shoulder to shoulder with a badass army of women who would take on the most powerful, wealthy special interest that's ever existed. And what I realized was those 3 things, my values, abilities, and desires, that helped me start this first major fire in my life. And I used that formula to help thousands of other women have breakthroughs in their lives. That doesn't mean something as big as starting a new organization, right? Sometimes it's just as small and significant as having a difficult conversation or leaving a job or a relationship or asking for promotion or going back to school. There's all these different things, and I interviewed over 70 different women for the book. There's all these stories and examples of women at all ages who decided to do that, and that comes down to this practice, right? You don't just bring your values, abilities, desires together, and suddenly you have this amazing fire in life. You may have a series of small fires, you may have one big fire, you may have to practice for a long time until it happens for you. But I think that's the way I see it, as something that we have to revisit and come back to over and over again.
What about for women that feel like, they've taken care of their kids their whole lives and they're missing that skills part? How do they identify? And I think everyone has their own skills, but how would you tell them to identify that one piece?
Ugh. I mean, it's such an important and big question. I want to step back a little bit and say women don't live on fire because they're weak. It's because they're wise. We see all the obstacles that society has laid out in front of us, and we decide it's sort of just better to stick with the status quo. We have all these shoulds in our lives, right? I should be thin. I should be busy. I should know what I want. There's all these different things that we put on ourselves, and we start to believe that those are our desires. And the reason we don't wake up every morning as women and ask ourselves, like, what do I want? Is because we know what would happen. Institutions would crumble, governments would fail, family systems would fall apart. There are consequences to wanting to live in a way that prioritizes our desires. And I say in the book, I do believe that men are raised and taught to fulfill their desires, and women are raised and taught to fulfill their obligations. And there's a big difference there. And so what I think is so important is that we figure out what it is we want, and we understand that what comes with that is blowback. Um, I tell a story of my own blowback in the book because I want women to understand, that we all receive it and it comes in different forms. For me, it was threats of death and sexual violence from gun extremists who were upset that I started Moms Demand Action. I mean, the threats started right away as soon as I put up my Facebook page, and they lasted for over a decade. But it could also look like a snarky comment in the pickup line at your kid's school. It could look like, your mother-in-law making a negative comment. Because I do think women who read my book want to do things differently. They may want to do more, they may want to do less, but ultimately they want to do things differently. When you do things differently, people have opinions. And that blowback, which we can talk about how do you withstand blowback, but that blowback often leads us to react in ways that are responses to the triggers of guilt and shame. Guilt is I did a bad thing. Shame is I am bad. And we all have that, particularly as women, right? We all want to be seen as good. That's what society tells us from very young age. Be good. And when you get blowback, you may get triggered into believing that no one wants to hear your story. I think that's what you mentioned specifically, but there's also perfectionism and imposter syndrome and fear of failure and a desire to disappear. And I name all these things in the book because so many women have said to me, I wish I had a handbook to know how to endure this blowback that I get that makes me feel guilt or shame. And so I lay it all out in the book. These are all the feelings that you're going to have. And these are all the ways people are going to try to prevent you from doing what it is you want with your life. And here are examples of women who have gotten to the other side.
It's interesting. So this is my kind of like second chapter and it happened to coincide with a divorce. And so I've been dating, which is by the way, I don't recommend. Okay.
I
Um
hope to never have to do that.
no, 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 not in your 40s, not no. But I was on a date last week and the guy said, "Do you think you lean a bit too much into your sobriety?"
Mhm.
Like, sister in sobriety and like that's sort of your shtick. And I thought, well, and I remember feeling for a moment like embarrassed, right? That I had a shtick. I was like, I didn't know I had it. And then I realized I'm like, no, no, like this is my passion. I almost died, right?
Yes.
Um, from drinking and doing drugs. And so the fact that I have this opportunity, this is my passion. So I
Yes.
will say this, and I am embarrassed to admit I didn't say much in response because I am so used to making myself like smaller, and especially in the
Yes.
dating situation. And I'm working on it, like, but I'm so used to like being the person that somebody else wants me to be. And so luckily now after the date, I can process and be like, that guy's not for me. A few years ago wouldn't have been the same thing. But how do you withstand that? I would call that like a mini blowback. But
But it is blowback. It's enough to make you rethink, right? And that's what I have seen so many times in my work with women throughout my career and my activism. And again, you know, thousands and thousands of women. And there's this belief that if we don't cross all the T's and dot all the I's, that we can't move forward with an idea or a thing or something that we desire. And if someone kind of like pokes at us at all, it makes us want to double back. And I get that instinct. We all have it, but that is what prevents us from living our fullest lives at all stages, right? And you remind me of a woman who came up to me recently on my book tour, and she kind of stood up and said, I really want to talk about mental health. I have worked in the mental health field for years, and I have family members with severe mental health issues. And I really want to use my expertise to help other people, but I'm not a doctor. I don't have a degree in this. So who wants to hear from me? And I just said, everyone, you have the right to share your story and to tell people about something you're passionate about and to help other people. So, your question was, how do you endure blowback? And I go into this at length in the book. And I'm so fortunate to have interviewed amazing women in the mindfulness space, everyone from Sharon Salzberg, who's a Buddhist meditation teacher, to Kristen Neff, who is a self compassion teacher. And what it really comes down to is three things, right? First of all, think about who's giving you the blowback. Who's the blowback coming from? Is this someone that you really respect their opinion? The odds are, like this date that you were on, like you don't know this guy. This guy doesn't know you. Who cares what he thinks? Really, right? And we
yeah.
always make it so personal and this is normal, right? Like because it hits us in the guilt and shame sensors, but we make it very personal when in fact it isn't. It is someone who doesn't know us, who doesn't care about us, who we don't need to trust with our, truest desires. The second thing is to really be thoughtful about separating truth from fiction. Like maybe you can take some of that information in and see it as feedback, but reject other pieces of that information. When I started Moms Demand Action, I just started cold calling people for their advice. And if I had listened to everyone who said, you're not the right person, this will never work, you can't do this, you shouldn't do this, it's already been done, right? On and on and on. I would never have started Moms Demand Action. But I figured out very early on that I had to sort of separate what was fact and what was fiction. And then the third thing is really sitting with those feelings. That's really difficult. And that's where self compassion and meditation come in my mind. This idea of you are going to have people who disagree or who are negative about what it is you're trying to embark on. That's just part of the journey. But can you sit with those feelings instead of reacting to them? And the answer is yes, because there are different tools that can help us be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think when I look back at that moment, I don't think the right thing for me would have been to be defensive, and so I just, like, took it in, and I did feel some, like, shame and embarrassment, but once I sat with it, I was like, "What does this guy do for a living? You know, what corporate ass job do you have? Are you really passionate about it?" Like,
It's just
yeah,
it's his shtick. What's your shtick?
what's your shtick? So so you have 5 kids, you're married. How did those expectations and obligations of family, culture, gender roles, how did or did it interfere with you pursuing your passion, and what did you experience?
Yes, I talk about this in the book too. When I started Moms Demand Action, I'd only been married a few years. My husband, ex-husband and I were figuring out, how to co-parent. My new husband and I were figuring out how to blend our family. And suddenly, within weeks of starting Moms Demand Action on Facebook, and it became a real life offline organization, I was busier than I'd ever been in my career, in my life. It was like a startup. From the moment that my feet hit the floor in the morning, it was what I worked on until the moment I went to bed. And it really impacted the dynamics of the family because I was the one driving all the kids to different sports events and making sure they were doing their homework and making dinner and making the lunches and all of that stuff. And suddenly I had to say to my ex-husband and my husband, like, I need you to step up. This thing is all consuming. And when my husband, my current husband, and I married, we decided because we had both been married before that we would go to therapy no matter what, at least once a month. And that was incredibly helpful to be able to sit there and to talk through how we were going to manage this huge upheaval in our lives. And also my ex-husband, stepped up in ways he didn't when we were married. And one of my favorite photos from that time is one of my kids was getting a soccer award and I couldn't be there because I was traveling for Moms Doing Action. And my ex-husband is on one arm and my husband is on the other arm. And, that was really, I think, important to the kid's development to have all three parents equally involved. And it changed their relationships for the better for everyone. And, when I interviewed these 70 women for the book, I asked them all the question, what are you afraid your deathbed regret will be? And I was certain they would all say what the universal deathbed regret is, which is that I didn't live a life that was true to me. And instead, every single one of them who had children said something completely different. They said that I will pursue what I want at the expense of my children, which is really fascinating that we have all been inculcated with this idea that pursuing our desires as women means that we are somehow causing our children suffering in some way. And I guarantee you, there are not many men who would say the same. I know that my husband would never feel that he had to compromise following his desires or being a good dad. And yet that is a mother's worst fear. And I interview a psychologist in the book who says, that is absolutely not true. The truth is that you can involve your kids in what you do if you want to, but even if you don't, it's really important for your kids, A, to know that you have other passions in your life besides them, because eventually they leave. And you need to be prepared for that because it's too much pressure on a kid to feel like they're your whole world. And B, you're setting an example for your kids. Would you want your kids to abandon their desires so that they could be, parents that are allegedly selfless? I don't think you would want that. And so when you set an example of being able to follow your desires, your kids get permission to do that too. And my kids are all grown now. My youngest is 25. And I promise you, none of them say, I can't believe you didn't go to that soccer game in 2006. What they all say is, I'm so proud of you for doing something that was important to you. And you've given me permission to do the same.
And so how do you know? I know for you and for me, our pivot was building, but really about a moment in time. So this tragedy you see at Sandy Hook, and for me, it was like my marriage imploding overnight, pushing me to like make sense of it. And so that was the push. But for women who are just kind of, I hate to use the word languishing, but just sort of,
Yeah.
going, yeah, meh, like they're just day to day doing the things. How do you know when it's time to pivot? How do you figure it out? How do you figure if it's with your career or your relationships? What what are the signs people can look at if it's not like a like come to Jesus moment, like it's sort
Yeah.
of for you and possibly for me too. Yeah.
I mean, I think we know. My guess is if you had to look back in hindsight, you knew, right, that things weren't going that well. And sometimes we avoid it, and it takes something in our life to make that change. For some women, I interview a lot of women who felt like they went down the wrong path in college. Interesting, a lot of them, the kids of immigrants who said to them, "You have to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer."
I'm an
And
orthodontist. I don't
an
wanna be an
orthodontist.
I don't
Exactly.
I was an orthodontist for a really long time. I'm not sure I ever
Oh
liked
my
it.
god, I love that story. I mean, you're exactly a woman in the book, and they go
Oh,
so far down this path, and they realize this isn't what I want.
they gave me 3 options. It was pharmacist, dentist, doctor. And so I was like, "I'll just do dentistry," and then I was like luckily, orthodontics is really fun, and it's not a lot of blood and gore, but I didn't wanna be in somebody's mouth.
And how many years of school and your life did you invest in being an
11.
orthodontist? I mean,
11. 11 years to get to a job that was like, meh.
and how long did you do the job?
Oh, like over a decade. I built a really big practice. I took it very
Yes,
seriously. Yeah.
yes. And so I talk to a lot of women that's graduating and doing the thing that they realized they didn't wanna do, that they've gone down the wrong path and they have to backtrack. For some women, it's having little kids and feeling overwhelmed and feeling like their partner isn't kind of doing their share of the work. For other women, it's perimenopause and menopause. It's, as you said, a marriage ending. It's kids going away to school. It's reaching a milestone birthday. There are all of these different things that can jolt us awake, but that's really in a lot of ways the premise of the book, which is we should always be asking ourselves, what do I want? Is this what I want? I mean, we need to live that way, the way that men do, as opposed to taking on all these shoulds. I should be an orthodontist, and therefore that is my desire because someone else told you, right? As opposed to what is it that I truly want? And the book is full of journal prompts and exercises that help women think about that, to say, is this place where I am in my life right now where I want to be? And once you decide it's not, that you want to do things differently, as I said earlier, maybe it's doing more, maybe it's doing less, but it is doing it differently. There are certain steps that you can take down that journey. It's not something that happens, and I'm sure for you this is the case. Like, you didn't make that change overnight. It took a while to try different things and to figure out who you are and what you wanted to actually be doing. And so that's where we go back to values, abilities, and desires. Let's use abilities, for example. So many women downplay their abilities or they don't know what they are. And there's a whole exercise in the book where I want you to write down everything you've ever done that's successful. That could include kids' birthday parties. Those are hard. Those require a lot of executive functioning, right? Like, what are all the things that you've done in your life that have been successful and you're proud of? Those are your abilities. But I also ask you to ask other people what they think your abilities are because we often don't see them in ourselves. We are taught as girls and women that we need to downplay our talents so that we're not bragging, so that we're not boastful, so that we're not taking the spotlight. And then that list is really important because it does two things. One, it reminds you constantly of what you're capable of and what you're passionate about. But it also tells you where you need to maybe work on new abilities because some abilities are innate. I'm never going to be an amazing singer, but some are acquired. And so if there's something that you want to do in your life and you don't yet have the abilities or skills to do that, you can go get them. And that might be part of the journey that you're on.
No, that totally makes sense. There are skills we don't even realize that that either we have or that we can make. Because this is Sisters in Sobriety, I will point out that that one sign that I wasn't kind of living my passion was that I was drinking every night
Mm,
when I got home from my fancy job as an orthodontist. And that's part of why we do this podcast is there's a lot of women like me that were midlife doing what they were supposed to do. And the one kind of sign that something is really off is that they're drinking
I'm
to
so
cope.
glad you brought that up because I tell the story of a woman in the book and I talk about a controlled burn. So, in wildlife, there's something that's been practiced by indigenous people and for centuries called a prescribed burn. It's like medicine for the earth, right? You do these burns to prevent out of control raging wildfires. So something doesn't go awry. And I talk about how you can do a controlled burn in your own life. And this is really an audit to figure out what is taking time away from you to be able to figure out who you are and what you want, right? To live on fire. And I talked to one woman, if you think about a controlled burn and what you need to eliminate, she realized that during the pandemic, she started drinking. She was drinking too much. And she was drinking in a way that was detrimental to her life, to her, her ability to figure out what it was that lit her up. And when she cut that out as part of her controlled burn, this part of this audit, it opened up all kinds of time and insight and awareness to figure that out. And for some women, it's drinking. For other women, it's doom scrolling. For some, it might be getting rid of the clothes in your closet, that are telling you you need to be 3 sizes smaller than you really are. There's so many different things that can free up 20, 30 minutes, an hour so that you can focus on yourself.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, hours, like you don't
Yeah.
even the drinking, I didn't realize how much time it was taking. I didn't have any hobbies, right? I noticed. And part of
That
me, it
was
was
a
like,
hobby probably, right?
yeah. And it was like, oh, I
Yeah.
don't have time for hobbies. I don't have time to go to a pottery class, but I do have time to open a bottle of wine. Yeah, that for sure for me was the first step to like when you remove that sort of like numbing layer to see, oh, I'm really not happy with what's going on with my life. I'm starting to feel this now, but have you ever felt this sort of sense as you're entering, like for me, my 40s, getting closer to 50, a sense of urgency? And how should we deal with that if we feel that? I feel that a little bit now. And when I start to look at 50, I'm like, podcast is doing okay, but I should probably do more with it. So, how do you deal with that sense of urgency? And have you felt it?
Absolutely. I mean, as you get older, you start to realize time is finite. And, I'm 54 now. And I think the great thing about that is like, I don't really care what people think as much. And I know what my strengths and my weaknesses are. I know who I am. That is a really helpful motivator in the second half of your life. But I also think urgency can become a should. It can become part of this capitalist culture.
Mhm.
Like I need to do something to make money. Like I need to turn my hobby into a moneymaker, or I need to get this done quickly, or, if this doesn't happen, then my life wasn't everything that it could have been. And that is just like so much pressure. I talk in the book about false fires. And the three I give examples of are finding your purpose. This idea that we have one thing that we're supposed to do in our lives, we're born to do it. If we don't do that, somehow we haven't lived a fulfilling life. And that's kind of ridiculous. A lot of people are making a lot of money off of that idea, just like self care, right? That's been sort of commodified and capitalized. Uh, the other thing that I talk about in the book is busyness. I'm so guilty of this. That is, I think, a way to address that sense of urgency you said. If I just fill all my waking hours with stuff I have to do for other people, then that is living a life on fire. And you can start to be addicted to that busyness. And happiness, this idea that we have to always be happy. And if we're doing something and we're not always happy, that we've failed. And, when you take on something you want to do, you're going to go through this period of a messy middle where it's not very fun. And so those are, I think what you're talking about, urgency can be a false fire too. Um, what we should focus on is what it is that we want to do and understand that, that might take a while. It might take a lifetime. It might feel like it never comes to fruition. But if it's something that we care passionately, deeply about, then we should put time toward doing it. Um, and the last thing I would say about urgency, I think about our mother's generation and how when we left home, they were supposed to sort of take up this hobby and disappear, become invisible. And they really were invisible to society, right? For the second half of their lives. We are so fortunate to be Gen Xers. I mean, we're the wealthiest, healthiest generation that's ever lived. And when we get to be midlife, it's kind of the beginning of a whole important, wondrous second half, or it can be. And we have to embrace that.
I agree. I Do you think though also, and I wish Kathleen, my co-host, was here because she told me when I was going through a really tough time to see an intuitive coach. And I was pretty hesitant, but one thing she did say to me, because I had been successful in my other career as an orthodontist, she said, it's time to change your definition of success. It's time to change it from just like money, and busyness was a big thing for
Yes.
me. It was almost like fetishizing, like, being busy all the time. And so learning to just rest. But have you changed your definition of success?
Oh, absolutely. I talked earlier about the things that we do to sabotage our desires. And whether that's, you know, perfectionism, uh, feeling to disappear, fear of failure, all those things. For me, it was martyrdom. And I tell the story in the book about how I said early on with Moms to Action that I was going to be a volunteer, that I wouldn't take money. And even 1 or 2 years later, when it became a full-time job for over a decade, I continued to refuse a salary and to give all the proceeds from my book and my speaking tours and everything else back into the organization. Even though the men who were in the organization were paid very well. And I think what I was doing was saying, "Oh, I'm a good girl. Yes, I'm provocative. Yes, I'm the tip of the spear. I'm out there, being a champion on a very polarizing issue. But don't worry, I'm still good over here. I'm not taking any money for it. I'm a volunteer." And I think that was a horrible choice, not just for myself, because when you don't take money for what you do, it impacts your self esteem. It's called the passion tax, right? It's kind of even the male executives at the organization, I think they assumed, oh, she's passionate about this, so she doesn't need or deserve money. But also, I set a bad example for other women who should get paid for the work that they do. So that was, I would say, one significant shift in my life and my mindset and thinking about women and the role they play in society, and that they are deserving of getting paid for their work. Um, but I think there are a lot of other shifts. I mean, the busyness thing for me was a huge wake up call too. I would spend every waking hour filling my calendar. If it wasn't totally full, I felt unfulfilled. And I'm getting back to reading, which is something I didn't indulge in for a very long time. I'm not working on vacations anymore. I can't tell you how many family vacations I had where there was a horrific shooting tragedy and I just abandoned them to go, do television and to do these other work and other things. So really just sort of prioritizing my wants and needs, which is uncomfortable. I will be honest with you. There are times that I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, this feels selfish, or what if people forget about me, or what is my identity? There are all these things that come up. But again, it's that idea of being able to sit with those feelings, being comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's funny. Even little things like I just like hit my elbow this morning, right? And it really hurts. And it's like, it's okay if I can't do like upper body weights today.
Yes.
It's okay just because it was on the schedule. It's okay to
Yep.
rest. So I love this concept, which is community and community of women. And so what role did community play for you, and what role can it play for others to kind of step into their fire?
I don't think you can live on fire by yourself. I do think it requires a community of other women. That's what I've learned along the way. I'm very much an introvert. I'm an only child. And I've never had a ton of friends. I've always just had one or two very close friends. And what the community of Moms to Man Action opened me to was the support and camaraderie of other women. And that has been life changing for me. Um, it really helped. I think because I was born in 1971 and ended up being pretty ambitious in the workplace. Like, I developed a lot of sharp elbows and a lot of masculine traits that really did not serve me when I started a women's organization and managed volunteers. Like, I had to unlearn a lot of those behaviors, which I'm so, so grateful that I did. It was such an incredible, like, coming back to this idea of practice, it was such an important practice for me in my life. But what's really funny is that I woke up when I decided to step back from on-screen action. I think I was like 50 years old and realized I needed more close friends because as you get older, it is not always easy to maintain those friendships. It's actually a lot of work that you have to put time into. And I was doing laundry one day and I had a podcast on in the background. And this guy said, if you don't have 5 people you can call in the middle of the night, you don't have enough close friends. And I thought, "Oh, well, that's okay. I've got 5 kids. Like, that's who I would call in the middle of the night with an emergency." And he said, "Except your family. You can't count your family." Like, well, what's the point of having 5 kids if I can't call them an emergency? But okay. And I set out, like I do so many things, where I just was like, "Okay, I'm gonna read up on how to make friends in my 50s."
Yeah.
And I listened to podcasts and I read books, and then I actually set out I wrote about this on my Substack. I set out on a journey to do that, to make close female friends, and it's been revolutionary, and I do have now 5 people that I feel like I could call in the middle of the night, women I go on trips with and women that I'm on text chains with, and it's just different energy than it is my husband's amazing, but it isn't the same as female friendship, and that is what I refer to in the book as a bonfire. These are your people, and maybe this bonfire starts because of a certain fire, like for me, it was Moms in Action, but I'm still friends with those women even though I've stepped back, and they're supporting me in this new chapter of my life. And that is something that we really have to work on. And I talk a lot in the book about how.
I just started doing this in the last couple of years, which was like very, very intentionally developing like a community of women. And it's been life changing for me.
How?
It's like, I think I have like 6 or 7 really close friends, like, that I would call and tell anything to, and I think it is something about I was, with my ex for 18 years, and so you kind of do let some of those relationships fade away, so mine was a combination of meeting new people and also kind of rekindling older friendships that there had never been any falling out, but how can people intentionally create a support system for themselves, especially if, like me or you, I realized when I stopped drinking, I was really introverted. I think it was the drinking that was making me extroverted.
Yeah, absolutely. It comes back to the fire formula. And the part to lean into of the formula, if you're talking about values, abilities, and desires, is really the values piece of this. And I did an event recently with Brene Brown, who's sort of the, grandmother of values, the North Star of values. And, there are hundreds, if not thousands of them. And we really don't take enough time to think about what are my values? Who am I? What's important to me at this stage of my life, right? Your values change. In 2012, for me, when I started Moms in Action, it was the safety of my family and community. But now that I'm an empty nester, I'm 54 years old, my values are different. Those things are still important, but they're not my priority. And really doing an inventory of your values, because ultimately the secret sauce to friendship is finding like-minded people.
Mm.
And I would travel all over the country for Moms Who in Action, and I would meet women who I thought had been best friends their entire lives, and they would say, "No, no, no, we just met through Moms Who in Action a year or 2 ago, but we will be friends forever," because they shared like-minded values. And that's the beauty of doing something you care about, that you meet other people who care about it too. And those are the people who should stay in your life for a long time.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the perspective they give is amazing. And so one perspective that my friends can give me is when to say no. And so what is the hardest no you've ever had to say, whether it's to other people, to yourself, expectations that people have had of you?
So, when I started Moms in Action in 2012, I just felt like, going back to the idea of practice, that it should be a practice to manage my ego for right speech, for right action. Like, I wanted to be something that helped me be a better person, not that glorified me. And when I had a first call, I was working with perfect strangers from across the country to start Moms in Action who came to me on Facebook. And one of the women lived in Silicon Valley, and we were getting off a conference call in the early days of Moms in Action. She said, "Whatever you do, don't get founder syndrome." And I said, "Of course not." And then I had to Google what is founder syndrome. And it's this idea that when you found something, when you start something, your ego can become so enmeshed in it that either when you leave, it can't succeed without you or you want to burn it down. And I did not want that for Moms in Action. I wanted it to last into perpetuity. So every year I decided to ask myself at the beginning of the year, is this the year I step back? Because I knew it would not be something I did for my whole life. I wanted it to be finite. And in the first few years, it was always no because we were just starting. And then in the middle, it kind of was like maybe, but there would be a horrific shooting tragedy or a piece of legislation I needed to work on, and I didn't. And then it was really when I was standing in the Rose Garden in 2022, and I was watching President Biden sign the first federal gun safety legislation to pass in a generation, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, that I felt this inner knowing. This is the bookend to your activism. This is time for you to step back. And that was a hard no to myself because my entire identity for 11 years had been wrapped up in this organization. Like what was I going to say when people say, "Who are you and what do you do?" But it was also a hard no to the organization and to all of our volunteers. At least that's what it felt like to me at the time. I had to tell my team that I was going to give them a year to step back. And then I had to say goodbye to people that I wasn't going to be doing this anymore. And it was something I'd planned for, and it was something that I was ready for and I wanted, and yet there was still a lot of suffering involved, right? It took a while for me to feel like I was separate from Moms in Action. And so I would say that was a really difficult no journey.
It was a no, but also that leads into what I wanted to ask you, but it was a win, right? So that
Yes.
is like, I'm standing in the Rose Garden looking at Biden sign a bill. That is a huge win. And we don't all get those wins, right? And we don't all get that external validation. So, what metrics or wins that maybe aren't as obvious as those let you know you're heading in the right direction? So, beyond external validation, what lets you know, what lets women know they're going in the right direction?
It is not hard to get people to come into an organization to volunteer when there's so many shooting tragedies in this country. It is hard to get volunteers to stay and to keep working. And that's why Moms in Action is really the only organization in America that has this huge volunteer base because we figured the secret sauce out for this. And I think this information is applicable to life generally. We decided to poll our volunteers and say, why do you keep showing up? And they told us two things. One, they felt like they were winning. And if you are not in the gun safety space, you might look at that and say, that's crazy because there's 400 million guns in this country. But if you're working on gun safety, you know that there are so many life-saving wins. And because they told us this and because we knew this was the truth, we came up with this ethos of losing forward. That you're going to lose a lot when you take on a special interest, but you're going to celebrate every single win. And I want to get back to that in a second. But the second thing they told us was that they kept showing up because they found their people. So those two things I think are really important in our lives. Celebrating every win and finding your people. And back to this idea of losing forward. What is the win? Like, that's up to us to decide what a win is, as opposed to like letting society tell us what a win is. Maybe, and I'm going to use the Moms in Action example, maybe a piece of legislation you've worked on really hard in your state just failed. But that isn't necessarily a loss because you've learned something to win the next time. Maybe you grew your chapter. Maybe you have relationships with lawmakers you didn't have before. You found something new that can help you try and win the next time. And I think that's the way we need to look at our lives, right? Like, let's celebrate every win. Let's reposition failures as losing forward. And let's decide that we are the ones that dictate what a win is, not to have other people tell us what that is.
Yeah, that I was going to ask you about failures next. And so what role they play. And so can you share a failure that you had with Moms Man Action that turned out to be a gift?
Oh, absolutely. In those early days, it was the spring of 2013, just a few months after this shooting tragedy. And I and our volunteers, many of us were very naive. We thought, oh, certainly lawmakers will act after this, 20 children and 6 educators are slaughtered in the sanctity of an American elementary school. And I was sitting in the Senate gallery in the spring of 2013 when the bill that was put forward, a bipartisan bill put forward in their honor to close the background check loophole in this country, failed by a handful of votes in the Senate. And some of those votes were from Democrats, which was pretty shocking to us. If that bill had passed, I don't think Moms Demand Action would have continued. We would have been like, okay, we spent several months doing this hard work and it worked, and now we go back to our regular lives. And what it caused us to do was to pivot and start doing this work in city councils and school boards and state houses and to build momentum until we had the right president and the right Congress in place. And so that was a huge loss that felt devastating, like, oh, maybe the country isn't ready for this. And yet what it was like a really important pivot. In 2012, a quarter of all Democrats in Congress had an A rating from the NRA. Today, not one does. Now we need to get to the point where both parties understand that we need to regulate guns to make us safer, but that's a huge seismic shift in American politics that wouldn't have happened had we had that win and hadn't failed early on.
Yeah, that's incredible to think about that if you had had the early win, it would have been like, "Ah, my work here is done." So when you look 5, 10 years ahead, how do you hope to continue stoking the fire in your own life?
I have made this a practice, this idea of my fire formula and listening to what I want as opposed to society telling me what I should want. Um, I never imagined I'd write this book. I thought when I stepped back from Moms Demand Action, I would take at least a year-long break. And instead, I got a call from Maria Shriver who said, I have a book in print I want you to write. And I said, okay, about what? And she said, what have you learned about women in your career and your activism? And that's how I came up with Fired Up. Um, and this book tour, right, has just been so amazing and wonderful. And women are taking the book and starting what they're calling bonfires. There are bonfires now in over 20 states where they're talking about personal, political, professional empowerment in person, which is something I think post-pandemic and in such a polarized nation, that's so revolutionary that they're doing this and having these communities and these conversations. I'm teaching something called Firestarter University, which is a year-long course based on the book. Over 1,000 women have signed up. Um, and again, like at 54, I kind of feel like I'm just getting started, and I'm going to keep asking myself what I want and follow wherever that takes me.
That's amazing. Just talking to you has inspired me and our listeners to find our passion and spark and fire. So thank you so much, Shannon, for being on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to talk to you.
And thank you for listening to Sisters in Sobriety, and we will see you next week. This was Sisters in Sobriety.
Thank you for listening and being with us today.
If you want to learn more about sobriety and meet your community, find us at sistersinsobriety.substack.com.
Are you a sister in sobriety? Then reach out on social media. We'd love to hear from you.
If you're feeling generous, leave us 5 stars and a review and follow us wherever you listen.
You'll never miss an episode. Until next time.